Welcome to the Reprofiles, where infertility meets injustice and nothing is off limits.
We're two nurses. We're certified reproductive health advocates, and we're here to tell you everything they didn't.
From the broken systems to the heartbreak left behind, we're here to connect the facts, the policies, and the pain.
Because silence isn't safety, and we're done being quiet.
This is the Reprofiles.
Infertility, injustice, and all things nobody warned you about. And welcome back to the Reprofiles. I'm Anne Marie, your fertility nurse, and then I have Elizabeth squared with me today.
Woo! It is an exciting day on the Reprofiles. You get not one, but two Elizabeths today. I am Elizabeth Lee, nurse, mom, co-host of this show, congressional candidate, some things like that. And we are joined today by one of my favorite Elizabeths in the whole wide world, Elizabeth Carr. Elizabeth Carr joins us. She was the first baby born in the United States as a result of IVF. The story that she'll tell you of her parents and sort of what they went through to have her is pretty amazing. But Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yay! I got to see Elizabeth about a month or two, about 2 months ago now. My goodness, time is flying. Out in Boston, which is, you live in somewhere in Massachusetts, correct?
Yes, in Central Mass. Yeah.
Central Massachusetts, yes. So I got the grand pleasure of seeing you, and I've seen you at different fertility conferences and spaces and places throughout my time in the IVF space. I remember when I did not know you personally, couldn't just text you and say, "Hey, want to be on my podcast?" It's funny because I just tell Barb Calora too. I'm like, Barb, I remember a day. For those of you listening who don't know who Barb Calora is, she is the former CEO of Resolve for 25 or so years, and she is amazing. Anyway, but I tell her, Barb, I remember when I was scared of you. I was like, in awe of you, So, but we're very happy to have you not just because it's you, but because this is National Infertility Awareness Week. And so why don't you start out by telling our listeners a little bit more about your story, how you got your start in IVF, and where you are now in the field. So give us the run.
Sure. So, I always say I did absolutely nothing. I just showed up on time, right? Like that. I always say that.
I like it.
So my parents met in college and knew right away after they got married, they wanted to start trying to build their family. They were woefully unsuccessful, unfortunately. My mother could get pregnant and not stay pregnant. She experienced 3 ectopic pregnancies and eventually had to have both of her tubes removed, which, kind of a key piece of equipment if you're going to build your family in the good old-fashioned way. And on recovery from her surgery, from her tubes being removed, her OBGYN said to her, "Well, I don't know what your plans are, but I just got back from a conference and I learned about this thing called IVF that was successful in England. And there's a husband and wife doctor team that are working on getting a program off the ground in Norfolk, Virginia. And it's going to be the only IVF program in the country. And I think you and Roger should apply." And my parents were of the mindset of, well, what do we have to lose? Because we've, basically exhausted all of our options other than, exploring adoption, which they were thinking about doing. And so he handed her a 1-page black and white 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with like no information about IVF on it because nobody knew anything about IVF at that point.
You didn't have an IVF nurse come with a packet and tell you all of your options? Judith, you got scammed, Judith. You didn't have me or Anne Marie to walk you through it. What?
I know, wild. So they applied, and about 2 weeks later, they got a phone call from Dr. Howard Jones, and he said, "Well, I think you'd be a great candidate. How soon can you get here?" Now, I want to back up. I want to pause there because it sounds like, oh, great, they moved to Virginia and had their baby. Nope. This is where it gets complicated, and I think why it makes sense, when we fast forward into what I'm doing now, why I'm so passionate about advocacy. They were still living in Massachusetts. Massachusetts had banned IVF. IVF was illegal in Massachusetts. Even though there was not a clinic in Massachusetts yet, Massachusetts said, we consider this experimentation on human cells, which was kind of weird. Doesn't make any sense to me, but we'll move on from that. So my parents didn't want to leave Massachusetts. And so they were flying down and back from Massachusetts to Virginia to access care. And let me remind you, this was the 80s. And so we did not have frozen embryo transfer. We did not have, she was the first modern IVF patient. So we did not have the hormone protocol. You give yourself shots at home. She was getting shots administered by her REI. And also it was the first time the hormone protocol was being done. So her medication was being flown in from Switzerland. These were extreme circumstances. And so fast forward, that is part of the reason why I am so passionate about access to care and insurance coverage, because quite frankly, they had to pay for all of that completely out of their own pocket. There was no insurance coverage. And top that off with nobody should have to fly across multiple states to access care. And they did, because they wanted a shot at building their family so much. So that's
It
how
actually sounds that, and unfortunately, that's still happening today. People are still flying to different states. They don't have insurance coverage. And this is 44 years, sorry to tell
Don't
you,
tell
tell
people
the
how old
age.
she is. It's not like they can go look her up online or
No.
anything, ma'am.
My bad. But this is still happening
Yeah.
today. No insurance coverage. Trying to find medications from the cheapest place that you can find. Some of them are getting them from overseas, and flying to get coverage. I feel like
As you were
we should
telling
be better. We should be doing better by now.
that was exactly my take when she was telling the story is I'm like, oh, we are still doing most of these things. I mean, REIs don't give injections, but we're still doing a lot of these things.
Spoiler, I was born in Virginia, which is a pioneer in having the first IVF baby. But guess what? I've been fighting the battle to get insurance coverage there and have a mandate there. There's still not a mandate there. It's my bucket list item. Before I die, I'm going to get IVF coverage there because there still isn't. And
Yeah.
as you said, 44 years later, I'm still testifying in front of the, General Assembly. Like, hi, me again. I'm back telling you the same story that 44 years ago, Virginia was a leader and we're still not there yet. So
It must feel like you're beating your head against the wall a lot with this because that's a lot. I mean, it's a lot already to be born into being this badass IVF advocate that you've grown into. But I would love to hear more about sort of what it was like growing up having that over you, and how did you end up now being still involved in the field? Because do you call yourself a journalist by trade? Is that because you do so many things that I'm like, she's all the things. And I also recognize you get called the first American IVF baby all the time. And you're like,
yes.
I am so much more than that.
Yes. Yeah. So I went to school to study journalism. So for most of my career, I was a reporter and editor at the Boston Globe, and then I went to work on magazines and etc. But I also still always had a foot in the fertility space as an advocate and also a ghostwriter for many, many companies in the fertility space because I had a front row seat to this field for my literal entire life. And so while I wasn't in the lab or performing the procedures, I had to become very well versed at being able to explain what I was watching to other people in a way that they could understand and make sense of. And I had to explain my own origin to other people in a scientifically accurate way, but using analogies and other lay terms and journalistic tools. And so some fertility companies and other people said, that's a very handy skill. We need that because scientists are really great at science, but they are not great at English, in terms of speaking, common people's vernacular.
Well, breaking it down. Yeah. Turning it into something that people understand.
Exactly. So now I work in PR marketing, and I'm also a patient advocate at a pre-implantation genetic testing company, which is the newest frontier, right? And so again, cutting edge technology, that is wildly complicated that needs to be explained extremely simply to patients. And, so I've always had this foot in the advocacy world, and I've never been able to really turn it off because I have heard, fortunately, the same arguments against IVF my entire life. And so when people are saying, oh my goodness, IVF's under attack in a way that it's never been before. No, no. I always say, actually, these arguments were happening before I was born because there were protesters outside of my mother's hospital wing. There were armed guards in front of my mother's hospital wing. There had to be code words and false descriptions of my parents given. And I grew up with something that I called an agent in reverse so that the press could not get a hold of my family unless they went through this one guy. Thank God it was the 80s and we had an unlisted phone number. I grew up in that environment. So when people say, oh, it's under attack like it never has been, no, we're just hearing about it now because we have a bullhorn known as like the internet and television and all these things. But it's the same. It's the same amount and the same arguments. So, it's wild.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I do follow your Instagram, and there are some posts that you have then that you get messages from people, and it astonishes me that people write to you and tell you that you should not be proud of essentially being alive and that you're an abomination. I don't That is terrible to me that someone is reaching out to you and telling you that. And so tell me a little bit about like when you were a kid or even as a teen, like did you get some of these things during your younger and teen life? I mean, now we have the internet, so people hide behind their keyboards now. But back then, did you get that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's just something that I grew up kind of understanding came with the landscape. For everybody that thanked my parents and myself for sharing our story and helping them understand a technology that ultimately led them to explore something that helped them build their family, there were probably 10 more people that spewed vitriol at us. And so we always kind of took the tact of the lack of privacy and the amount of hate was always justified if just one person learned about this and was changed for the better. And that has always been the little kernel that keeps me going is like for every 10 pieces of terrible hate mail, there's still the one that I get that like makes my whole day. And that one cancels out all the other terrible stuff. And so that's why I do it. And that lack of privacy and all of the other stuff is totally worth it. It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love how you say that you're the petri dish princess.
So
Yes.
good.
I love that. I love that title for yourself. Did you make that up yourself?
Yeah, so it came about as a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, riff at myself because, I don't take myself too seriously about, like I said, I really didn't do anything. I just showed up. Yes, I use my voice now, but like when I was born, it was all my parents and the doctors. I literally did nothing. I was a scheduled C-section. I literally just laid there. So I always say Louise Brown was the first in the world IVF baby, and she's in England. So she's clearly the queen, which means I'm just the princess. And so it started as like a wink, kind of joke. And we always
Mhm.
have this banter that like, yeah, okay, Louise, you might be the first in the world, but you were natural cycle. And I was the first modern baby. So like I'm still the princess. And so
Did your mom know Louise back then?
no, I mean, she had heard of her. She had heard the story, but, I didn't, and I didn't even meet Louise until I was in my 30s. Nobody had ever gotten us together.
Wow.
I didn't meet her
Wow.
until an MRSI conference where we both got together. God bless Angie Belzos. He got
Wow.
us on stage together. And yeah, so that's how that hashtag came about, was really like as a jab. And then it just kind of took on a
I
life
love
of its own. Yeah.
I love it, and I like how I feel like you're taking control of that.
Yes.
And
Right.
you're kinda like putting the naysayers, like, I'm gonna own this.
Yeah,
This is me.
exactly. Yeah.
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 Elizabeth, when you're When your mom recounts the story or she talks about, 'cause I think about, boy, there are so many similarities between having to travel and this and that, but, armed guards and things like that, and not having anyone to ask, any friends to ask or see, like, "Do you know anybody that" like, she was so alone. Did she ever talk to you about has she ever said how she got through it, how she coped with it all?
Yeah, so what's interesting is there was a cohort of patients in this program, this experimental program, but they were not allowed to talk to each other because they were all on totally different protocols and they weren't sure which hormone protocol was going to be like the magic, jackpot. They were trying to figure it out. And so they didn't want people comparing notes. And so everybody was kind of walking around, looking at each other knowingly and kind of hoping like, oh, I hope you're successful, but also hoping, but I also hope that like I'm successful. And so they didn't really talk to each other, which was weird. And so my parents always said they just really relied on each other and very few people in their inner circle knew what they were going through. She had a few very close friends who knew what they were doing, who were very supportive, but really didn't understand it because what the heck was IVF? Nobody knew what IVF was.
Right.
And so they didn't really understand like what was involved and how complicated and they did tell their family and thankfully the family was very very supportive. But again, like nobody really understood the magnitude of what they were doing. So that was tough. They just had each other. They just had each other. And, thank goodness my dad was like a rock. My dad is like the engineer who just kind of is like, okay, we're going to do one step at a time and is very like focused and so they balanced each other very well like that. But yeah, they did not
Amazing.
have anybody else at all and no information. Zero information. It's wild.
That really is wild. Were you gonna ask a question?
Yeah, I was going to say nowadays, people do have their support groups either through their clinics or, starting support groups. There are support groups online. There are certain companies that are creating them so people can discuss their, well, yes, they can compare and contrast, but everybody has their own journey, right? They all have their own different protocol that they're going to use. So now, with the information age, now that we have it's good that people are able to reach out and talk to each other and get that through. Another question I have for you is do you ever get do like children of IVF, people who are products of IVF, do they reach out to you and talk to you about their experiences?
Yeah, and that's also one of the reasons why when I hit my probably 20s is when I really kind of cranked up the volume on the advocacy because for a long time I felt like I was this in this weird space where I was like kind of trotted out like a show pony of like, "Hey, look what we did. We made this cool person. See? She's like the IVF baby. Like, aren't isn't technology cool?" And but I didn't really have a voice, right? And I could see things going on that I wanted to have a say in. And everybody kind of just patted me on the head and was like, "Oh, aren't you adorable?" And I was like, "I have opinions." I went to,
You're
by the
like,
way,
"Yes, I am," and also
I went to an all women's college, so like I have opinions. No coincidence that it was in my 20s that this happened because I was in college and I was like, going to use my voice. Um, and, but for a long time, I felt like, well, I'm just this visual representation of this science. And I did not experience infertility myself. I was not an infertility patient. So, what right do I have to talk about something that I don't really have any experience with? And then I felt like, but wait a minute, I am the product of this, and nobody's taking into account how the kids feel about it. Like we were just dumped into this thing, which of course I'm incredibly grateful for my life and I obviously want to be here. But also there are things that, I definitely would have changed if I had had a say about it. Who wants to be on the cover of Life magazine completely naked, like other than a diaper, with no say? And, who wants to be on TV all the time at age every age milestone? Who wants to have camera crews following them every step of the way? Who wants to have tabloids writing about them and feel like they have no repercussions at all? And that wasn't any doing of my parents. That was just tabloids deciding could write about me because I was in the public eye. But I was a child. And, how do kids feel about people talking about the way that they came into the world? And so I was like, no, I do have a right to talk about this. And also, I had people reaching out to me saying, yeah, I mean, I have feelings about how I know how much my parents went through to get me here. And wow, is it a lot of pressure? I hope I live up to all they went through. And I said, boy, do I relate to that. I relate to that on so many levels because you realize some people fought for 10 plus years to have you and spent a lot of money and a lot of time. And you are acutely aware of that. And, like, I still cringe when people call me a miracle. I hate that term. And it's not anybody's fault, but I hate it because it feels like that's a lot of pressure. I don't want to be a miracle. I just want to be myself. And so, yeah, I started using my voice and I was like, nope, you know what? If they're not going to let me sit at the table, I'm going to stand at the end until they pay attention.
Yes.
Nice.
Well, you obviously represent both the origin story of IVF in America, but also its future. I'm curious, what worries do you have about where reproductive medicine is headed right now? And I'll add a little more color there with the restorative reproductive medicine pathway that's out there. I was struck as soon as you said your mom had no tubes because she would have been somebody for whom that method of infertility treatment would have been
Yeah.
futile. And she never would have had you ever, ever. So, what worries you about the direction things are going right now? And also what gives you hope? Because I think there's some positive things too.
Yeah, I mean, I think what worries me is this idea that that people other than the patient should be prescriptive of what the correct pathway is forward for a patient. My parents were educated. I'll use that term loosely because they had almost no information, but educated about IVF and they chose to pursue it with as much information as they had. I feel very strongly that, hey, listen, if you want to go investigate restorative reproductive medicine and IVF and you decide to choose to go pursue RRM, that's your prerogative. You have autonomy. You can do that. However, I don't feel like laws should prescribe such things to you. And I have always felt that way about anything. I don't think people should be prescribed IVF either. I think you sit down with your REI and they say, here's based on my years of expertise, I'm going to tell you I think your best bet is IVF. But a patient can say, you know what? I'm still going to try IUI first. And that's their prerogative. They have that choice and autonomy. So that particular thing, I really worry about patient autonomy being taken away, patient choice being taken away. That continually worries me, always. And like forever. And then I think what gives me hope is, this idea that we are seeing increases in access. So on the one hand, we're not terribly moving the needle on insurance coverage, but we are seeing fertility deserts become less and less. So, while we are still seeing people fly to other states to access care, there are more and more fertility clinics and providers in areas that there didn't used to be. So it is easier now to access care than it was, which is always hopeful. And so I'm continually hopeful that we will see fewer fertility deserts. And I think, maybe there is something to be said about, do we open it to other types of providers providing care? Who knows? I don't know. I have mixed feelings. I have no idea. But could it improve access? It could. So I think that is really hopeful. I think that is really hopeful that we'll see fewer fertility deserts by and large. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's a good point about having the full breadth of options because we've talked about this on the show before about, part of the RRM, part of their talking points were that people are being pushed into IVF. And unfortunately, as somebody who worked for a very long time in an IVF clinic, I get that. I understand that. I understand how patients would end up feeling that way. And so, what do you think, though? I'm curious, what do you think is still so controversial about it or still so misunderstood about it, about IVF. Because that's the other piece. I've never been able to wrap my head around the critics of it.
Yeah.
So, do you have any sense of what folks are really still fundamentally missing when it comes to their understanding of IVF itself?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily about the technology because even when you explain the technology is not, it's really not that complicated. I've I've been saying the same sentence since I was 6. It's a sperm and an egg fertilized in a petri dish. Once fertilization happens, it goes back into the mother's womb or whatever, the womb, and 9 months later, I came out just like everybody else. That's literally the sentence that I've been saying since I was 6 years old, and that's like the simplest version I can give you, all right?
I can't imagine at 6 years old having to explain this to people.
Literally, Dr. Georgiana Jones taught me that sentence at 6 years old, made me recite it until I could do that over and
Wow.
over and over again. So she did a good job. It's forever burned in my brain. But I think it's not even the technology. I think it is this fundamental idea that science and religion cannot agree on where life begins. And they have never been able to do that. And they will never be able to do that. They will never be able to find common ground on where they think life begins. And so fundamentally, we will always have this argument. We will always have this friction of science versus ideology. And it is the only place in medicine that this happens. We don't have science versus ideology when you're talking about knee replacements. We don't have science versus ideology when you're talking about cancer treatment. It's the one place when you talk about potential for human life, all of a sudden people go, whoop. And it's that ideology versus science. And it's that constant friction. And it's been in existence since before I was born. And actually, Neil Shaw did a fantastic piece, if anybody wants to like really nerd out, about before I was born. And the Nixon administration actually initially created a panel to try and like solve this problem. And they were going to study and make a recommendation about IVF. And I think he basically explains in his piece, they kind of figured out quickly that like it was going to be science versus ideology. And so they kind of kicked the can down the road and never really addressed it. And then the panel just kind of expired. And so we've continually had this problem in this country where we've never really talked about it and never really agreed about it. And so here we are. And it's going to just continue to be that way, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Yeah. True.
Yeah, it is such a foundational belief, I guess you could say. And it's frustrating, I'll say from my own perspective, having and all three of us have this intimate perspective of having looked at embryos in a microscope and carefully transported those embryos over to the next room so they could be, we treat this whole process with such reverence and
Yes.
care and attention. So for me, I don't, especially as having been a labor and delivery nurse who did a lot of work with like preterm births and babies that were going to be born too early to survive and things like that. So the line between, yeah, as you said, like they won't agree on where life begins. Why do you think though then that it's so widely popular? I mean, it's most Americans agree that IVF is fine. Do you think then it's just the fringe that is yelling the loudest about it? And also, what do you think? How do you think we ought to combat it? So you think we can never come to a place of agreement? I know I just asked you like 4
That's
questions, but
okay. I don't necessarily think it's fringe. I think it is both and. I think it is wildly popular because it is still the single most effective treatment that we have for infertility still. And so 1 in 6 people that experience infertility need it, as well as LGBTQ or, da 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 and so they recognize, I mean, most people that have this ideological belief absolutely know somebody who's probably in their family that needed this treatment. And so they're probably also
Mhm.
grateful that they had this treatment and might have a grandchild, son, brother, sister, whatever that had this treatment, but they also might not be able to square that up against their ideology. Right. And so that's the weird and beautiful and odd thing about humans is that we can have those contradictions exist and they don't square up and it makes absolutely no sense. But we're comfortable compartmentalizing. We are like, we're grateful it exists. And yes, I'm happy my cousin Sarah could do it, but also I'm vehemently opposed to it and think it should be regulated and da, 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 da. And like those two things somehow make sense in somebody's brain. And I can't do that. I can't square those things up, but a lot of people can. And so, yeah, I think I don't want to say never because that's not how I'm wired. I'm just like, Pollyanna that way. I'm very optimistic about everything. So I think we'll probably get to a place where we could find some common ground, but I have no idea what that common ground could possibly be. So, but I think it does exist. But I think it's going to take the right kind of people to really sit down in a room and hash it out. And I think it's going to take the right kind of people to like say, okay, like I hear you on the ideology. And I understand and I want to understand where you're coming from. And I hear you on the science and I truly like respect and understand the science. But like, can we find a middle area? And I just don't think that has happened yet. I really don't. I really don't.
Yeah. I mean, I live in Florida. So in my state, I have a senator who has a grandchild from IVF, yet voted against the right to IVF, bill that Elizabeth and I were there for the vote. He absolutely said no. And to me, I'm like, how? Why? I don't understand. And
Well,
it's
I guess it's
frustrating.
similar as other things though too, because abortion, by and large, most Americans agree that you should have some access to it, varying degrees of, how much, but yet how many Republicans have abortions? It's really a matter of power and control over
Yep.
who
Hmm.
gets to, and who doesn't.
Yep. Yeah.
That's
And
where
again,
it gets scary.
it's that weird contradiction, right? Of like both and it makes no sense, but that's very, very common. And I've been hearing it my whole life. And it continually is something that like literally makes my brain melt, but is
Yeah.
so common that the
Same.
only thing I can make sense of is that like humans are just one big contradiction and you know, we can basically almost explain anything away to ourselves.
Yeah, I guess. So, I recently saw your new posting this week about how, this is National Infertility Awareness Week. And we're all celebrating. I'm wearing my orange. Elizabeth is wearing orange as well. And orange hair. And she has orange pants on, people. She
Oh, there you
does. Yeah. But this week is very concentrated. I'm sure you're very busy this week. People want to talk to you and get your insights on things. One of the things that you mentioned was this is a 52-week thing. It's not just a 1-week thing. We need to make this more of year round rather than just 1 week.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit like what should we do? How should we get the messaging out throughout the year? How can we help?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm very passionate about this because it's a little bit like, yay, I'm excited that everybody's paying attention, but like, don't take your foot off the gas on day 8. It's still out there happening. So, obviously there's very small things you can do. Sign up for the Resolve Advocacy Network, sign up for ASRM's text messages and information, and be hooked up with them. They're going to keep you posted on what's going on legislation wise as well. There are great groups out there, even regionally, that are doing things on the advocacy front. I'm on the board of All Paths, which used to be called Resolve New England. I'm also on Families Out Loud, who is another great organization who's also involved in the advocacy arena. So even just taking a small action to know what's going on and get the alerts, because you can, just take 5 seconds to do that and they'll let you know like, hey, we need you to send an email, make a phone call, do whatever. That one action can make you feel like, okay, check, I've done something good. So do that, first of all, but also decide how you want to get more involved. If that feels like that's not enough, that's too surface level, you can decide, or you can donate your time, talent, or treasure, right? You can donate money, you can donate your effort, or you might have a specific skill. So, with me, I have a platform and a voice, and I was also a writer. So anytime something big comes up, I happen to like to put pen to paper. And when all the things happened with Alabama, I remember I was on family vacation and I texted Rebecca Flick at Resolve and I was like, I'm on family vacation, but I've got a draft of an op-ed and can you do a proofread? And I'm in the car, you know, typing away. And because of that, it got picked up everywhere. And then, because of that, Senator Tim Kaine was like, oh, I remember she was born in Virginia. I got invited to the State of the Union. And because of that, I was on all the morning talk shows. And it created this domino effect of helping to raise more awareness about what was going on in Alabama and why this was important. Right. And so that was my talent. I can write. So, just deciding like what's important to you and how do you want to use it. And if you're not comfortable sharing your story, that's fine. You don't have to. A lot of people aren't. And it's not for everyone. And it is not for the faint of heart. There are some days that I am really raw when people ask me to do things. And I'm just like, not today. I'm tapped out. Get back to me in like a week or a month. And I will have capacity then. But there are some days that I'm just like, I can't. And that's okay. So there are other ways, you can donate money or you can just be a resource for people. Even if you don't want to share your story, you can direct them to information that's helpful. When people reach out to me on my Instagram or my website, I set aside like a lunatic an hour every night, even weekends, to respond to people. Because if somebody reaches out, I want to make sure that I recognize that because I know what an effort it takes to reach out. And so if they reach out their hand, I'm going to take it. And sometimes it's, do you know of a grant? And I have a list of grants that are super niche or whatever that I'll send to people. Or it could be, I really don't understand IVF. Can you take 5 minutes? Yes, I can. So it can be something as simple as that. And you just never know. Like advocacy takes a lot of forms, and advocacy is not done by one person. Advocacy is most effective when it is a volume game. And when I mean volume, I mean people, and I also mean noise. And so, a week is great, but 365 days is way better.
Well said, well said, because I think of all that we can or have accomplished even inside of one National Infertility Awareness Week or inside one day of a Hill Day, advocacy day type of thing. But you make such a great point, and it's that advocacy is an ongoing thing. It's not a one and done thing. It's usually not even a couple of times. It's something you end up living and breathing. And like you said, it's every day, 7 days a week because you care enough to lend the hand, because I imagine your mother, and maybe you imagine this too, would have loved a helping hand
Yes.
during, the time that she was doing this all by herself. And there's plenty of people in this world today, probably people listening right now that are in your mom's shoes in a way. They don't have anybody they can talk to about it. They don't really know or understand about it. Maybe they're afraid to ask.
Yes.
So, man, like that's an opportunity though to really support and be there. And that's, I think that's what I believe that's what makes you such a wonderful beacon of hope and truth and all of those things, because you are really real and you're willing to tell people, that raw story. I think we have time maybe for one more question. Anne-Marie, I feel like I stole all the questions. Do you have any other?
I'm good.
I know, but we always joke about who talks too much, and
So
you can.
that's okay. I'm the editor, so I can do whatever I want with it.
She's like, I cut you out.
So, Elizabeth, I know that you had your first book was Under the Microscope, which brilliant title,
Thank
because
you.
you were under the microscope from the beginning, I guess
From
you could say.
preconception, microscope
Preconception,
exposure.
yes, yes. So, there's a new book on the way? Question
Yes.
mark?
Very
Okay.
excited. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so my hashtag Petri Dish Princess took on a whole life of its own. Actually, my Instagram followers prompted this new book. So a bunch of followers said one day on one particular thread, I can't remember what it was, that they really liked the hashtag so much that it really needed to be a book. And I kind of chuckled about it. And then my dear friend Ali Prato, who is of Fertility Rally and Infertile AF podcast, and has her own work of art book series, which is fantastic and is specifically for children, messaged me and was like, let's do this together. And I was like, yeah, that sounds great because I don't know what the heck I'm doing if I do a children's. I only deal with adults. And so we collaborated, and Petri Dish Princess is going to be out in hopefully October. So to coincide with ASRM. And the reason we wanted to do a children's book is because I wanted children to feel like they could recognize themselves in their own, in this origin story, because I never had that. I never had the children's baby book that explained how I got here. And I always tell this story. Poor Elizabeth's heard it like 1,000 times. But when I was like 10, the school nurse split my class in half, and the boys went across the hall and the girls stayed on this side. And she showed the film of the birds and the bees and how, babies are made. And at the end, she said, does anyone have any questions? And it got real quiet. And I raised my hand and I said, not everybody gets here that way. And I explained IVF because even though I was the only IVF baby in the room, I had this thought of like, you know what? I don't want anybody to feel left out, and I feel left out. So I'm going to tell them how I got here. So
I love
that
that.
was
I
my
love.
thinking. Yeah, that was my thinking with this book, is like, I don't want any IVF babies to feel left out. So I'm going to let them know that, they should be proud of how they got here.
Absolutely. And Elizabeth and I have talked about sex ed on this podcast before. That should be something that's in sex ed, right? Comprehensive sex ed should include all of
No,
that.
it should absolutely now talk about infertility as a thing.
Yes.
Imagine if 20 years ago we just did a set of cycle day 3 labs on every, well woman visit of childbearing age. We could have known so many things.
Well, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, because fast forward a couple years ago, my son comes home and says, you might get a phone call. I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, during our genetics module, they were talking about how babies were made. And I said, not everybody gets here that way. And then explained to the class how you were born. And I was like, yeah. I was like,
That's
so
amazing.
proud. I was like, good
I'll
job.
bet you were. That was like you leveled up on your parenting skills that day.
I was
That
like
was
so
probably
proud of them. Yeah. And I was like, I hope they do call me. I hope they do.
well,
I'm going to give them a piece of my mind.
you know what though? There's something to be said about being brave enough to speak the truth about something.
Yes.
And you and I share that in common, in that like I have this like no fair muscle. And if I see something that's not fair, I'm like, that's not fair. And
Yes.
it's really just this like, so I love that. Now I can't wait to read it to my son. I've attempted many a time to explain to him and his little best friend, who are 3 months apart in age, who are in the same cryo tank together, no less, try to explain, but it's very difficult. So I'm very excited that you're giving families an option to have something like that. When we adopted our middle daughter, we really relied on a number of adoption books to help her be able to embrace her origin story. And so this is wonderful that IVF mamas and daddies will have the ability to use this with their kids. And that must feel really super special. How does your mom feel about that? She must be very proud of you.
Yeah. I mean, she's excited. She also she was an English teacher. And so
Is she your editor?
she forever is always my toughest editor. And so I knew if we could get the copy through her and her red pen, we were golden. So
Yeah.
I knew if I could get my copy through her, I was guaranteed an A+ in anything I ever did.
Wow.
It is Judith Carr red pen approved. So I think we're going to be okay.
Very exciting.
Nice.
I can't wait.
Yes.
I can't wait to get a copy of it. And I can't wait for people listening to go out and learn more about Elizabeth Carr. Give us your social handles. Is it eJordan, I think? Or
Yeah,
tell us
at
your social media.
Yeah, at eJordan12 is my Instagram, and you can go ejordancarr.com is my website. Those are my
Yes.
most active things. But if you reach
Yes.
out to me on Instagram, I promise I will respond. It's not a robot. It's not a team of people. So if I'm slow, it's just because it's been a busy day. But I will actually respond to you. I promise.
You heard it here first, folks. She's going to respond. Well, thank you for spending the time on this National Infertility Awareness Week to tell folks why it's so important for this to become this and National Infertility Awareness Week, and laying the groundwork for what we plan to do the next 51 weeks of the year. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us. Those of you who are listening, definitely check out Elizabeth online. She is just an absolute star in the field in terms of being a phenomenal advocate for all sides of IVF. And so then until next time, we shall post our episode and see what y'all think. Make sure you leave in the comments anything that you want us to talk about. We try to do that. Sometimes we have to change course because the news is very active these days, but we'll do what we can and we will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.